David Johnson had grown used to the quiet life. 2 years had passed since the day he lost his wife, Sarah, and his young son, Ethan. It had been a horrible car accident, they told him, one that had claimed both lives instantly. David never saw their bodies. The caskets were closed, and all he had left were memories. He'd spent endless nights haunted by questions he couldn't answer, and the empty house felt like a void that he filled only with his routines, small acts like morning coffee on the porch, late-night walks, and weekends spent trying to remember how to breathe without feeling the ache of loss. One particular Saturday, David went for a walk in Liberty Park. It was a place he'd avoided for 2 years. This was the park where he and Sarah had spent so many evenings while Ethan played on the swings. It felt like a betrayal to go back, yet somehow he found himself drawn there, as if compelled by an invisible hand. The air was crisp, and children's laughter drifted through the trees. He forced himself to stay, promising he'd just walk for a few minutes. He was about to turn back when he saw a flash of blonde hair and a small figure darting toward the playground. David's heart froze. It was so sudden, so visceral, he nearly gasped. The boy's face was turned away, but David knew that golden hair. It was Ethan's hair, the same color, the same wayward curls he'd always loved. He took a few shaky steps forward, not daring to blink, afraid that if he did, the vision might vanish. But it didn't vanish. The boy was real, standing right there, alive. He turned slowly, almost as if sensing David's gaze, and in that split second, David's world tilted. His son, the child he'd grieved, was standing in front of him, very much alive. David's legs moved without his permission, carrying him closer. He couldn't breathe, couldn't speak. His eyes filled with tears, blurring his vision, but the closer he got, the more undeniable it became. There was no mistake. This wasn't a memory or some painful hallucination. This was his son, and that woman standing beside him. The one with her arm around the boy, gently guiding him away, was Sarah, his wife. A wave of emotions crashed over him. Shock, confusion, disbelief, anger. He felt like he was being torn apart, his mind struggling to comprehend what his eyes were telling him. How could they be here? How could they be alive? He had mourned them, buried them. He'd walked away from the cemetery and the life they'd shared, only to find them here, in the very place where they'd spent so many family moments. He wanted to scream, to call out, but all he managed was a choked whisper. Sarah. His voice barely carried, but somehow she heard. She turned, her eyes meeting his, and in that instant, David saw the truth. She knew he would find her one day. The look in her eyes wasn't one of surprise. It was resignation, almost sorrow, mixed with a faint trace of relief. Ethan's eyes widened in recognition, but Sarah placed a protective hand on his shoulder, as if shielding him from a ghost. David's legs wobbled, and he staggered as the truth hit him full force. They weren't ghosts. They hadn't died. They had left him without a word, without an explanation, leaving him to piece together the shattered remains of his life. For 2 long years, he'd thought he'd lost everything. Yet here they were, and judging by their calm demeanor, they hadn't been hiding under tragic circumstances. No, they'd been living. He felt a surge of anger mingled with betrayal and hurt. How could they have done this to him? How could they have left him to mourn them, to suffer alone? Sarah's face was a mixture of fear and regret as she slowly approached him, guiding Ethan along. David could see the lines around her eyes, the signs of age and weariness. But she was real. She was standing right in front of him, breathing, alive. The reality of it crushed him, and for a moment, he thought his heart might burst from the sheer force of the emotions flooding him. But Sarah's calm, almost composed expression told him she had expected this moment, and that realization stoked his anger even more. "David," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the playground. "We need to talk. I know this is a shock, but please, for Ethan's sake." He felt a sharp pang at her words. For Ethan's sake. His voice was louder than he intended, and people turned to look, their curiosity piqued by the unfolding scene. He lowered his tone, but the bitterness seeped through. "You left me, Sarah. You left me to believe you were dead. How could you? Do you have any idea what these last 2 years have been like?" Sarah flinched, visibly pained by his words, and glanced down at Ethan, who looked back and forth between his parents, confused and a little frightened. "David, I didn't want to leave you. We didn't have a choice. It wasn't safe for us. For any of us. Safe." He almost laughed, but it came out more like a strangled gasp. "How is it safer for you to let me think you were dead? How could that possibly protect me? Protect us?" Sarah took a deep breath, her gaze steady. "There's so much I can't tell you here, David. But please, for Ethan, can we go somewhere private? I'll explain everything. I promise." David looked down at Ethan, who was watching him with a mixture of hope and trepidation. He couldn't bear to frighten the boy, to burden him with the bitterness boiling within him. But he also couldn't walk away. He needed answers, needed to know why his family, his life, had been ripped from him without warning. With a nod, he gestured for them to lead the way. They left the park together, the silence between them thick and heavy. His mind raced with questions, each one more painful than the last. He couldn't decide if he wanted to hold his wife and son or demand they explain every agonizing detail of the years he'd spent grieving them. They finally reached a quiet, secluded spot near the edge of town, a small cafe where they could sit and talk. The place was nearly empty, and as they settled in, Sarah looked at him, her expression somber. "David, what I'm about to tell you, it's not going to be easy, and it won't change what happened, but I need you to understand." He leaned forward, his hands trembling as he clasped them together. He wanted to reach out, to touch her, to make sure this wasn't some twisted dream, but he held back. "Start from the beginning," he whispered, his voice raw with suppressed emotion. "I want to know everything." And as Sarah began to speak, unspooling the secrets she'd held close for so long, David felt the foundations of his life shift once again, sensing that whatever truth was about to emerge would be something he could never have imagined. David sat across from Sarah and Ethan, his heart still hammering in his chest. He could hardly believe this was happening. His wife and son, whom he had buried and mourned, were sitting right in front of him, alive. The initial shock was slowly giving way to an undercurrent of anger that he couldn't control. 2 years of agony and loneliness had been his reality, and here they were, living a life he knew nothing about. His hands trembled slightly, both with the anticipation of hearing their story and the lingering resentment that they had put him through such unimaginable grief. Sarah met his gaze, her eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and sadness. "David, I know this is impossible to understand right now. There's no easy way to explain what we've been through. But please, know that every day we were gone, I thought about you. I worried about you. There was no choice. None that wouldn't have put you in more danger." David shook his head, fighting back the anger bubbling to the surface. "Danger? You left me without a single word, Sarah. You faked your own deaths. I mourned you both. I put you in the ground. How could there possibly be a reason for that?" Sarah took a shaky breath, glancing at Ethan, who was sitting quietly, his small hands clasped together. "It wasn't meant to happen this way, David. We were never supposed to disappear entirely. I was going to reach out to you, to let you know we were safe once everything calmed down. But things got complicated. Very complicated." David leaned forward, his voice low but laced with an intensity that made Sarah flinch. "Start from the beginning. I want every detail, Sarah. If you're asking me to understand, then don't leave anything out." Sarah nodded, looking down as she gathered her thoughts. "You remember the car accident that night, right?" Her voice was quiet, filled with a pain that seemed to transcend words. "Well, that accident wasn't just some random tragedy. It was deliberate. It was meant to be fatal. We were targeted." David's mind reeled, and he could feel his breath catch in his throat. Targeted. Why? Who would want to hurt you and Ethan? She hesitated, then continued. A few months before the accident, I started receiving strange messages, notes left on our doorstep, calls in the middle of the night that would hang up if I answered. At first, I thought it was just a prank, but things escalated. One night, when I was out with Ethan, a man approached me. He gave no name, no reason for the encounter, but he warned me that something I had done was going to cause severe consequences for my family. He left as quickly as he appeared, and I was left wondering if it had all been in my head. But then, the threats became more explicit. They knew details about you, about Ethan, our daily routines. David clenched his fists, feeling a surge of protectiveness he hadn't felt in years. And you didn't tell me any of this. You kept this a secret. Sarah looked up, her eyes brimming with tears. I was trying to protect you, David. I didn't want you to worry, or worse, get involved in something you couldn't control. I thought if I stayed quiet, they would leave us alone. I tried to keep our lives normal, but one night, they found us. We were driving back from a friend's house when another car sped toward us, and there was no escaping it. They forced us off the road. I thought that was it, that we wouldn't make it. But something strange happened. They didn't finish the job. She paused, looking down, her hands gripping each other tightly. We were left unconscious, and when I woke up, I was in a cabin, secluded, and Ethan was safe beside me. I was disoriented, but then a man appeared. The same man who had warned me before. He told me we had a choice, to disappear completely, to let the world think we were dead, or face further consequences. I was told that if we tried to go back, if we even attempted to make contact with you, the consequences would be fatal. David felt a strange chill settle over him. The gravity of her words weighed on him. So you left, just like that. You didn't even consider letting me in on it, didn't even give me a chance to say goodbye. I didn't know what else to do, David, Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. I thought it was the only way to keep you safe, and it was supposed to be temporary. They promised me that once things settled, we'd be able to come back, to contact you. But weeks turned into months, and it became clear that they never intended to let us go. They were keeping us captive, not physically but psychologically. The threats, the constant surveillance. They had us trapped. David stared at her, torn between disbelief and fury. And you thought this was acceptable? To leave your husband in the dark while you went off, letting me think you were both dead? Sarah winced, clearly affected by the hurt in his voice. Every day, I questioned that choice. Every day, I felt the weight of what I'd done. I was constantly torn between wanting to reach out to you and knowing that any contact might put you in danger. But one day, I couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't bear the idea of leaving you alone without an explanation. So I started looking for a way out. I connected with people, underground networks that helped families escape from situations like ours. David raised an eyebrow, trying to grasp the full weight of her words. So you've been on the run this whole time. And these people, they just let you go. A small, sad smile touched her lips. Not exactly. We had to be clever, and it cost us. We've been through more close calls than I can count. For every safe place we found, there was someone close on our heels. But eventually, I found a way to make contact with an old friend, Laura. She's been helping us hide, finding places where they wouldn't think to look. And today was the first time in 2 years that we felt safe enough to come out of hiding. David felt a pang of guilt mingling with his anger. He glanced at Ethan, who had been silently watching, clearly understanding more than any child should have to. So you've been on the run. You faked your deaths to protect me. And you still didn't think I deserved to know. Sarah took a deep breath, struggling to hold back tears. I know it sounds unforgivable. And maybe it is. But I need you to understand. There was no other way. They had power beyond anything we could fight. And even now, I'm not certain we're safe. I just couldn't keep running without knowing if you were okay. I had to see you." David looked at her, the woman he'd loved, the mother of his child, the person he'd thought was lost to him forever. He could see the pain in her eyes, the toll the years had taken on her. And as much as he wanted to be furious, he couldn't ignore the sorrow and the desperation she must have felt. "So, what now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She reached for his hand, her touch light but real, grounding him in the present. "Now we have to decide if we're going to keep running, or if we're going to face this together, even if it means risking everything." David closed his eyes, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He didn't know if he could forgive her, didn't know if he could just accept everything she told him. But he knew one thing: he'd spent 2 years without his family, and now, given the chance to have them back, he didn't want to lose them again. As he opened his eyes and looked into hers, he saw the same determination, the same courage that had driven her to make impossible choices. And despite the confusion and anger still swirling within him, a small part of him couldn't help but admire her strength. "We'll face it together," he said finally, the words tasting bittersweet. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with danger and unanswered questions, but for the first time in 2 years, he felt a sliver of hope, hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way back to each other. The decision to stand together brought a fragile peace over David, Sarah, and Ethan, yet it was accompanied by an ever-present tension, a feeling that their reunion was being watched. They stayed in the small cafe for a while longer, trying to piece together their next steps, but each moment felt like borrowed time. David kept looking over his shoulder, scanning the faces of anyone who might be listening, anyone whose gaze lingered a moment too long. This was no longer the quiet life he had lived since losing his family. It was a life on edge, filled with invisible threats that he could only feel creeping closer. Leaving the cafe, they quickly walked back towards Sarah and Ethan's temporary apartment. The building was on the outskirts of town, in a rundown area where people minded their own business and didn't ask questions. David felt a pang of discomfort as they entered the building. It wasn't the kind of place he had ever envisioned his family living. But safety, it seemed, demanded sacrifices. Once inside, they locked the doors, pulled the curtains, and Sarah immediately went about preparing for an exit. David watched as she gathered belongings, packing a few small bags with practiced efficiency. It struck him just how accustomed she had become to this life. She moved quickly, but her hands were steady, her face calm. Ethan, too, seemed to understand the routine, taking his mother's instructions without question, showing none of the worry that had become second nature to David. Seeing his son so composed in such circumstances only deepened the ache in David's chest. He wondered what memories Ethan held of his old life, if he even missed it. As they finished packing, David heard a loud knock on the door. He froze, his mind racing through 100 possibilities, none of them good. Sarah signaled for him to stay silent, pressing a finger to her lips as she motioned for Ethan to hide in the back room. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. David's heart pounded, and he could feel the surge of adrenaline preparing him to fight or flee. Sarah moved silently to the peephole, her face paling as she stepped back quickly. "It's them," she whispered, her voice filled with dread. "They found us." David's stomach churned. There was no time to wonder how they'd been discovered, no time to plan. Sarah grabbed his arm and led him to the back, where Ethan was hiding. She pointed to a small window leading out into the alley. "We can't stay here. We'll have to make a run for it." As the pounding on the door intensified, David followed her lead, helping Ethan climb through the narrow window before squeezing himself through. The alley was dark and narrow, the chill of the air biting into him. They moved quickly, slipping through side streets and alleys to stay out of sight. David tried to steady his breathing, his mind buzzing with questions he had no time to ask. Who were these people? Why would they go to such lengths to hunt his family? And how had Sarah managed to keep them hidden for so long? They made their way to a small, dimly lit park. The night was silent, save for their hurried footsteps crunching against the gravel. Sarah stopped and looked around, her face filled with a mixture of fear and determination. We can't stay in one place for long. They know where we were. It's only a matter of time before they catch up to us again. David felt an anger rise within him, stronger than before. Sarah, you're going to have to tell me who these people are. I need to understand what we're up against. She took a deep breath, glancing at Ethan, to make sure he was safely occupied, his head resting on David's shoulder, the exhaustion of the night's events finally overtaking him. They call themselves the Syndicate, she said quietly. They're a powerful underground organization, powerful enough to manipulate authorities, to track people who get in their way. I don't know everything, but I know enough to realize that they have resources far beyond what we could imagine. They threatened us to keep quiet, and if we didn't, well, you saw how quickly they came after us. David's mind raced. The Syndicate. He had heard whispers about criminal networks before, but nothing that sounded as vast or dangerous as what Sarah described. Why did they target you in the first place? Sarah hesitated, her gaze flickering to Ethan. She looked like she was carrying the weight of 1,000 secrets, each one more difficult to reveal than the last. It started with my work, she said finally. A few years ago, I came across documents in my office that revealed financial transactions, illegal operations, things that would bring down some very powerful people if they came to light. At first, I thought it was just paperwork gone wrong, a mistake, maybe a setup. But then I started receiving those warnings, the threats. They were watching my every move. David felt a chill run down his spine. And you didn't tell me any of this. I didn't want to drag you into it, David, she replied, her voice thick with regret. I thought I could handle it alone. I thought I could keep it away from us, from Ethan. But they didn't give me that choice, and by the time I realized how deep I was, it was too late. The reality of her words settled on him like a weight. He wanted to be furious, to demand why she'd put them in this position, but deep down, he knew she had tried to protect him. So, what do we do now? He asked, his voice softer. Sarah's gaze hardened. We keep running. We don't stop until we find a way to expose them, to bring them down. There are people, whistleblowers, activists, who are willing to help. We just have to find them. Just then, a sound echoed through the park, the crack of a twig underfoot. David's pulse quickened, his body tensing as he scanned the shadows around them. In the dim glow of a nearby street lamp, he could see two figures moving toward them, their faces obscured by hoods, their movements careful, predatory. Run, Sarah whispered, grabbing his hand. They turned and darted through the park, weaving between trees, their breaths coming fast and shallow. David held onto Ethan tightly, adrenaline pushing him forward as they navigated the maze of darkness. The footsteps behind them grew louder, closer. He could feel the weight of fear pressing down on him, but he forced himself to keep moving, to protect his family. They reached a small street on the other side of the park, where a car was idling, its headlights off. As they approached, the driver's window rolled down, and a familiar face appeared. It was Laura, Sarah's old friend, the one who had helped them escape the Syndicate's grasp in the first place. Get in, she hissed urgently, her eyes darting around to make sure they hadn't been followed. Without a second thought, they climbed into the car, and Laura sped off into the night, taking them further away from the life David had once known and deeper into a world of secrets and danger. They drove in silence, the tension thick in the confined space of the car. David held Ethan close, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He glanced at Sarah, who was staring out the window, lost in thought, and then at Laura, who was focused on the road, her face set in determination. Finally, he broke the silence. Laura, why are you helping us? Why are you putting yourself in danger? Laura's eyes met his in the rearview mirror, a hint of something unspoken flickering in her gaze. Because I've seen what the Syndicate is capable of, she said, her voice low. And I've seen what happens to people who don't fight back. I used to work for them years ago. I know what kind of people they are, and I couldn't live with myself if I stood by and did nothing." David felt a sense of both relief and dread. They had an ally, someone who understood the syndicate's inner workings, but it was clear they were up against something far bigger than he'd ever imagined. He squeezed Sarah's hand, their shared fear and determination forming an unspoken bond between them. As they drove into the early hours of the morning, David realized that his life was no longer his own. The quiet existence he'd known was gone, replaced by a reality filled with shadows and threats. But he also knew one thing: he would do whatever it took to protect his family, to find a way to bring down the syndicate and reclaim their lives. No matter what lay ahead, he was ready to face it, one step at a time, with the people he loved by his side. As dawn broke, the car carrying David, Sarah, Ethan, and Laura pulled into the driveway of an unremarkable house nestled in a quiet wooded area far from the city. The house seemed worn and forgotten, its shutters faded and roof speckled with moss, yet David sensed a strange safety in its isolation. Laura parked the car, turned off the engine, and glanced back at them, her expression unreadable but resolute. "This is where we'll stay for now," Laura said, her voice low. "No one knows about this place. It's off the grid, and the syndicate won't think to look here. We have a little time to regroup, but not much." David helped Ethan out of the car, and they all gathered their things, moving quietly as if the trees themselves were watching. The air was thick with the lingering tension of their escape, and the silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken fears and exhaustion. The inside of the house was simple but functional, with the bare essentials scattered in a modest arrangement. Laura led them to a small living room, where they sat in a tight circle, the weight of the night's events still pressing heavily on them. David took a deep breath, letting his gaze rest on Sarah. The familiarity of her presence, after 2 years of grief and longing, felt surreal and fragile, as if one wrong word might shatter it all. "Sarah, I need to understand, fully. No more half-truths, no more omissions. If we're going to face this together, I need to know everything about what we're dealing with." She looked down, her fingers trembling slightly as she clasped her hands together. "I know, David. I owe you that much." She glanced at Laura, who gave a small nod, as if giving her silent permission to continue. Sarah's voice was steady, though tinged with regret. "The syndicate isn't just any criminal organization. It's a network that reaches into places we'd never suspect, with connections in law enforcement, corporations, even politics. A few years ago, I was assigned to review financial records for a client who had been linked to some shady dealings, nothing unusual on the surface. But the more I dug, the more I found anomalies. Money moving through shell companies, hidden accounts, transactions that didn't add up. I tried to report it, but each time I raised concerns, my superiors brushed me off. I didn't understand why until I received that first warning." David's hands clenched as he listened, the reality of what she'd been up against settling heavily on him. "They threatened you." "Not directly at first," she replied, her voice growing softer. "It started as subtle messages, almost like they were testing me, trying to see if I would back down. But as I pushed further, they grew bolder. One night, someone broke into our house while Ethan and I were asleep. They didn't take anything, didn't hurt us, but they left a message scrawled on the wall in red paint. 'You know too much.' I knew then that it wasn't just about the work anymore. It was personal." David felt a cold anger rising within him, both for the fear she must have endured alone and for the danger she'd brought into their lives. "So you went on the run?" Sarah shook her head, a bitter smile flickering across her lips. "I tried to go to the authorities first, but they were always one step ahead. Every time I tried to report it, the officers would subtly steer me away, hinting that there was nothing they could do. I realized that they had people everywhere, and there was no one I could trust. They were in control of the entire narrative. Eventually, they made it clear. If I didn't disappear, If I kept pushing, they'd come after Ethan and after you too. David felt the world spinning around him as the full weight of her words settled in. His wife had been battling an invisible enemy, a hydra with endless heads, each one just as deadly as the last. He looked at Ethan, who was quietly listening, his young face serious beyond his years, and he felt a pang of sorrow for everything his son had endured in silence. How had he survived this nightmare? David wondered, being uprooted and hidden without ever knowing why. Laura broke the silence, her voice hard and steady. The syndicate thrives on fear and manipulation. They don't just go after people. They destroy their lives, dismantling them piece by piece until there's nothing left. When I was still with them, I saw it happen too many times. Good people who thought they could make a difference, they ended up either destroyed or on the run, just like Sarah. That's why I got out, and why I'm helping you now. I couldn't sit back and let them do this to another family. David glanced at her, seeing a fierceness in her gaze that gave him a strange sense of hope. Laura wasn't just helping them out of pity or obligation. She was doing it out of a deep-seated desire for justice, a resolve that mirrored his own feelings. He nodded, his anger sharpening into determination. So what do we do now? Laura leaned forward, her eyes scanning the room as if planning each step. The syndicate's greatest weakness is exposure. They operate in the shadows, and they rely on fear to keep people silent. If we can gather enough evidence and go public, we might be able to dismantle them. It's risky, but it's the only way to ensure they can't hurt any of us ever again. David felt a thrill of fear mixed with excitement. This was dangerous, and the consequences could be dire. But for the first time since discovering his family was alive, he felt a sense of purpose. He was no longer just a bystander to his own life. He had a role to play, a mission to protect his family and reclaim the peace that had been stolen from them. As they began to discuss a plan, Sarah revealed that she had kept some of the original documents she'd uncovered, hiding them in places she thought were secure. I've stored copies in several locations over the years, never keeping them all in one place. I knew someday I might need them. And now, it looks like that day has come. David nodded, his mind racing as he processed the details. If we're going to do this, we'll need help. We can't fight this alone. Laura agreed. I know a few people in the media, individuals who specialize in whistleblower cases. They have ways of getting information out without revealing sources, ways to bring this to light without putting us directly in the crosshairs. But once we start, there's no going back. They spent hours planning, going over every detail, every contingency. By the time they finished, the first rays of dawn were breaking through the trees outside, casting a soft light over the room. David felt a strange sense of peace settle over him, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. He knew the danger they faced was real, but he also knew that, for the first time, they had a chance to fight back. The following days were a blur of preparation. They moved carefully, retrieving the hidden documents and compiling the evidence. Each piece of information was like a weapon, a blow against the invisible enemy that had haunted their lives. As they worked, David grew closer to his family, rediscovering the connection that had been severed for so long. He saw Ethan's resilience, his quiet courage, and it filled him with a pride he couldn't put into words. But just when they were ready to take the next step, an unexpected twist threw everything into chaos. One evening, as they were finalizing the details, Laura received a call from a contact within the syndicate, a friend she'd left behind when she escaped. "They know," she whispered, her face pale as she hung up the phone. "They found out about our plans. They're coming for us." Panic spread through the room, but David felt a surge of determination stronger than the fear. He looked at Sarah and Ethan, at the family he'd fought so hard to protect, and he knew he couldn't give up now. They'd come too far, and the syndicate's hold over their lives was finally breaking. He took Sarah's hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "We face them together," he said, his voice steady. "Whatever happens, we do this as a family." Laura nodded, her expression fierce. Then we make our stand. This ends here." They prepared themselves, each one drawing strength from the other, ready to face the final confrontation. They had spent years living in fear, running from shadows, but now, for the first time, they were ready to step into the light, to face the enemy that had haunted them. The syndicate's power had thrived in the darkness, but David knew that even the darkest night couldn't last forever. Together, they would fight, and no matter the outcome, they would do so united, determined to reclaim the lives they had lost. The tension in the safe house was palpable as the minutes ticked by, each one a reminder of the danger closing in around them. David, Sarah, Ethan, and Laura had fortified their resolve, but there was no denying the fear that gripped each of them. They knew they were standing on the edge of something monumental. Laura's contact had confirmed it. The syndicate was aware of their plans, and now they were coming. The faint security of their secluded hideout felt as thin as tissue paper. The syndicate wouldn't stop until they had silenced anyone who threatened to expose them. David stood by the window, peering into the early dusk. The trees cast long, dark shadows over the house, and every flicker of movement seemed like a threat. He turned to see Sarah quietly comforting Ethan, who sat curled up on the couch, clutching his mother's hand with a look of resolve far beyond his years. David's heart ached for his son. For too long, Ethan had been pulled from place to place, forced to live in the shadows of fear and secrecy. David promised himself, no matter the outcome tonight, he would end this so that Ethan could have a life free from this terror. Laura emerged from a small back room, where she had been speaking with her contact. Her face was grim. "They're on their way. We have maybe half an hour, 45 minutes at most." Sarah's hand tightened around Ethan's, her face set in steely determination. "Then we have to be ready. We've come too far to back down now." David nodded, a sense of calm settling over him. They had spent the past days gathering all the evidence they could: files, encrypted data, and testimonies from people the syndicate had harmed. If they could hold out long enough, they could upload the files to a secure server Laura had arranged with her contacts, ensuring the information would be shared widely. It was their only chance to truly expose the syndicate's reach. "Laura," David said, glancing over at her, "if they break in before we're ready, what's the plan?" Laura looked at him, her jaw clenched. "We don't let them take us alive. If they capture us, they'll do everything in their power to extract what we know, then bury it. They won't hesitate to get rid of us if they think it's necessary. Our only advantage is that they need the files before they can silence us." David swallowed hard. The gravity of her words left no room for doubt. This was a fight to the end, and they were facing an enemy with no limits. He took a deep breath, mentally preparing himself for what was to come. As the moments passed, they prepared the house for defense. David and Laura barricaded the doors, reinforcing them with furniture, while Sarah moved all the files onto the encrypted drive, typing quickly with a sense of urgency. Ethan watched in silent apprehension, too aware of what was happening to be spared from it. They taught him how to use the small back window as a potential escape route, though David prayed it wouldn't come to that. The first sign of their arrival was a pair of headlights appearing down the long, narrow drive leading up to the house. David's heart pounded as he watched the car come to a slow stop about 50 yards away. 4 men got out, dressed in dark clothing and moving with a purpose that left no doubt. They were professionals. He saw one of them pull a small device from his pocket, likely a jammer to prevent any cell signals from leaving the area. They were taking every precaution to make sure no one got out, and no message went through. Laura pulled David back from the window. "It's time," she whispered. "Remember, we don't let them get their hands on us." David nodded, his grip tightening on the small handgun Laura had given him. He'd never held a weapon before, but tonight, it felt like his only lifeline. He looked over at Sarah, who had just finished encrypting the files. She glanced at him, her expression a mixture of fear and resolve. "They're going to try and storm in," she whispered, her voice trembling but determined. But as long as we keep them from getting to the laptop, we have a chance. Everything's set to upload automatically if we can just hold them off long enough. The men outside began circling the house, testing windows and doors. David heard the faint clink of tools as they started working on the locks. His pulse raced, adrenaline flooding his body as he braced himself for what was coming. A loud crash echoed through the house as one of the back windows shattered. They were in. Laura gestured for David and Sarah to stay in the living room while she took position near the kitchen, aiming at the back entrance with a steely focus. The first man slipped inside, moving quietly, his silhouette barely visible in the darkened house. Laura fired, the crack of the gunshot shattering the silence. The man staggered back, hitting the floor as a second figure leaped into view. The chaos that followed was a blur. Another man forced his way through the front door, and David raised his gun, his hand trembling as he fired. The shot went wide, but the man ducked, startled, giving Laura enough time to reposition. Sarah grabbed Ethan and moved to the back, keeping him shielded as they crouched low, hidden from view. The tension was unbearable, each moment stretching out as they fought to defend themselves. More shots were fired, each one a reminder that they were running out of time. David saw Laura take down another man, her movements swift and practiced, but he could tell she was growing tired. They couldn't hold out much longer. He could hear the others regrouping outside, their voices low and threatening as they plotted their next move. Suddenly, Sarah's laptop emitted a small beep. The upload had begun. David felt a surge of relief mixed with fear. The files were transferring, but it would take precious minutes for them to reach the secure server. They only had to hold on a little longer. One of the men broke through a barricaded door, rushing toward the living room where David stood. David fired again, the shot striking the man in the shoulder, forcing him back. But as he fell, David saw two more figures advancing, their eyes cold and merciless. Panic rose within him, but he forced himself to stay focused, to protect the family he'd fought so hard to reunite with. Then, in a twist neither David nor Sarah expected, they heard the sound of sirens. Laura's contact had managed to send in an emergency call, alerting the authorities just in time. The men outside hesitated, their expressions shifting from confidence to alarm as the flashing red and blue lights drew closer. They hadn't planned for this. The syndicate operated in the shadows, and police attention would jeopardize their entire operation. As the police vehicles pulled up, the syndicate's men scattered, vanishing into the woods surrounding the house. The remaining assailants, those who had breached the home, abandoned their mission, realizing they could no longer contain the situation. The upload completed with seconds to spare, and Sarah quickly encrypted the device, hiding it in a drawer just as officers entered. David sank to the floor, exhaustion and relief crashing over him. Sarah hugged Ethan tightly, both of them trembling as the reality of their narrow escape settled in. Laura, despite her calm exterior, looked equally shaken, though she managed a faint smile as she met David's gaze. "We did it," she whispered. "The files are out there now. They'll be exposed." The police moved quickly, securing the house and escorting them to safety. Over the next few hours, David gave his statement, watching as the officers took in the evidence, the documents, and the recordings they had managed to upload. He knew that the syndicate would be furious, that they would stop at nothing to retaliate. But he also knew they had lost their advantage. Their secrets were no longer hidden. In the days that followed, the evidence spread like wildfire. News outlets picked up the story, uncovering years of corruption and deception. The syndicate's influence began to crumble as more people came forward, emboldened by the courage of those who had dared to fight back. David and Sarah knew they would have to live cautiously for the rest of their lives, but they had won a victory that would protect countless others from the same terror they had faced. The experience had transformed them, but it had also brought them closer together, strengthening the bonds they thought had been severed forever. And as they walked away from the remnants of their past, David felt a quiet resolve settle over him. He had faced down fear, confronted the darkest parts of human nature, and in the end, he had reclaimed his family and his freedom. The syndicate's power had crumbled in the face of truth, and now he could finally begin to rebuild the life that had been stolen from them. In the months that followed the night they exposed the syndicate, David, Sarah, Ethan, and Laura found themselves in a state of surreal calm, a quiet after the storm that left them both relieved and uncertain. The syndicate's secrets had been plastered across every major news outlet, with journalists, activists, and law enforcement agencies dissecting the organization's vast network of corruption and illegal activities. High-ranking officials were implicated, as were powerful corporate entities. The syndicate had been brought to its knees, its reach dismantled piece by piece as more whistleblowers and victims came forward. Yet, even with the syndicate in disarray, a sense of lingering caution shadowed their every move. David could feel it whenever he stepped outside, as if eyes might still be watching from some dark corner. While the syndicate's leaders were either on the run or behind bars, their influence had been so deeply ingrained in society that it was impossible to know if they were truly safe. Their lives had changed, but David was no longer the same man who'd once feared the unknown. He was ready to face it, knowing he had his family and newfound allies by his side. They had decided to leave the small town where the syndicate had first found them, opting for a new start in a place far from the memories that haunted them. Laura helped arrange a fresh beginning, using her connections to secure new identities, new jobs, and a home in a quiet coastal village where they could finally, truly, live in peace. David found work as a teacher at the local school, his passion for helping others renewed by everything he'd endured. Sarah found a position with a non-profit organization, one that focused on aiding victims of corruption and criminal exploitation. It was work that allowed her to give back, to turn the pain of her experience into something meaningful. For Ethan, the adjustment was both exciting and challenging. He'd been a child caught in an adult's nightmare, learning to survive in ways no child should ever have to. Now, as he explored the beaches and forests near their new home, he was slowly reclaiming the freedom and innocence he'd been denied. David watched his son with a mixture of pride and relief, knowing that every day Ethan spent here was a day further away from the darkness they had escaped. Laura, who had become more than just an ally, chose to remain nearby. She visited often, becoming something of a surrogate aunt to Ethan, her presence a constant reminder of the courage and sacrifice it had taken to bring down the syndicate. She had committed herself to a mission of her own, helping others trapped in the syndicate's wake, rescuing families, and dismantling what remained of the organization's network. One evening, as the family sat around a small fire on the beach, watching the waves crash against the shore, David felt a peace he hadn't known in years. They hadn't spoken much about the syndicate or the events that had almost torn them apart. Instead, they allowed themselves the luxury of normalcy, savoring each other's company, the simple joy of being together without the weight of danger pressing down on them. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in hues of pink and gold, David wrapped his arm around Sarah, pulling her close. "You know, there were times I thought I'd never see this day," he said, his voice quiet but filled with emotion. "There were days when I believed I'd lost you both forever, that I'd never get to feel this again." Sarah leaned into him, her hand finding his. "I thought that too. There were moments when I was sure we'd never get free, that the syndicate would keep us trapped in their grip for the rest of our lives. But we made it through. We're here together, and that's what matters." Ethan, who had been quietly poking at the fire with a stick, looked up at his parents with a small, thoughtful smile. "So we're safe now? Like, for real?" David and Sarah exchanged a glance, their hearts heavy with the knowledge that while they were safer, there was no guarantee that the syndicate's remnants wouldn't try to seek revenge. But they owed Ethan the truth, or at least as much of it as he could understand. David reached over, placing a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. "We're as safe as we can be, Ethan. The people who hurt us have lost their power. They're not as strong as they once were, and they can't hurt us like before. But no matter what happens, we're here together. That's what makes us strong." Ethan seemed to take comfort in his father's words, nodding solemnly before returning his gaze to the fire. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the waves as night settled around them, a blanket of stars emerging in the sky above. The weeks turned into months, and gradually their lives began to settle into a rhythm. David threw himself into his teaching, finding a renewed purpose in guiding young minds, many of whom reminded him of the boy he'd once been, curious, eager, and blissfully unaware of the darkness that sometimes touched the world. Sarah's work became a calling, a way to channel her past pain into a force for good. Together, they spoke at conferences, shared their story with organizations, and advocated for laws that would protect others from the kind of nightmare they'd endured. They became voices for change, using their story as a rallying cry against corruption and injustice. One day, a letter arrived in the mail, bearing no return address. David's stomach twisted as he opened it, fearing that some last remnant of the syndicate had resurfaced to haunt them. But as he unfolded the letter, he realized it wasn't a threat. It was from one of the people they'd unwittingly helped through their actions, a woman who had been forced to flee the syndicate years before, who had lived in fear until the evidence they'd exposed had given her the courage to come forward. The letter was filled with gratitude, each word a testament to the ripple effect their actions had created. As David read, a strange peace settled over him. Their struggle, their sacrifice, it had not been in vain. They had not only reclaimed their own lives, but had ignited a spark of hope in others who'd once lived in darkness. He shared the letter with Sarah, who read it with tears in her eyes, a quiet smile breaking through the sorrow that had lingered. "It's strange, isn't it?" she whispered. "How something so terrible could lead to something so beautiful. We lost everything, but in a way we gained even more." David nodded, taking her hand. "We found our way back to each other, and we helped others find their way too." As they walked to the beach that evening with Ethan laughing and running ahead of them, David felt the weight of their journey finally lift. He looked at his family, his heart swelling with gratitude for the resilience they had shown, the love that had bound them together, even when circumstances had conspired to tear them apart. Their life was simple, but it was full of meaning. And though shadows of the past lingered in the background, they had found a way to live without fear, to embrace each moment as a gift hard won. Together, they had faced the darkest parts of the world and emerged into the light. As they sat on the sand, watching Ethan chase seagulls along the shore, David found himself reflecting on everything they'd been through. The sacrifices, the danger, the secrets that had nearly destroyed them. He thought of all the people who'd crossed their path, both allies and enemies, and how each had shaped the journey that brought them here. And as the waves lapped at their feet, he turned to Sarah, a question lingering in his mind. "Do you think we'll ever be completely free from the shadows of the past?" Sarah took his hand, her gaze steady, her voice filled with quiet strength. "Maybe not entirely, but we've learned how to live beyond them, to find joy despite the memories. And that's what freedom really is, isn't it? It's choosing to move forward, to find peace, even when the past tries to hold us back." David nodded, feeling the truth of her words settle over him. They had found freedom, not in forgetting, but in embracing the strength that had carried them through, the resilience that bound them together. And as they watched the sun dip below the horizon, casting its final glow over the ocean, David knew that, no matter what came next, they would face it side by side.